With all the brown grass here, at this stage of the year on this land base, are cattle maintaining? Are you able to put on weight using strategies? The ignorant in me says, I don't see a lot of good forage here. Mm-hmm. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. The most I can hope for right now is to maintain body condition. And most likely body condition will continue to decline a little bit until we reach enough new grass growing that they're actually able to start gaining back. And the first amount of grass isn't even very nutritious. It's just the plant's attempt to send solar panels up, So the kind of compensatory gains that we get when cattle really start to put on 3+ pounds a day, that doesn't come until early springtime. But they'll start to pick back up generally in December-ish. Right now, I'm managing cattle to mitigate metabolic stress. So I am grazing really large pastures right now. I'm letting them kind of find their own way around. Still all part of my grazing plan, so I'm not overgrazing anything. Plants aren't growing right now to be overgrazed. But I'm basically allowing them to take the pastures down in their nutritional quality to an extent, and then moving them into a new area that's not so different from the point at which I brought them off that they have a big, shockwave through their digestive system. It takes like a week and a half for a cow's rumen to turn over and adjust. So if I'm making too many changes in that period, they're never able to kind of catch up. So what that means is I'm not grazing any of these dormant pastures down all the way, because then if I move them into a fresh pasture they haven't grazed since spring, then they're probably going to get their runs actually, because the protein content from any green forbs or plants that are still a little fresher, or perennial grasses that haven't been grazed yet, those plants are going to be higher in protein and compromise their gut if they're not adjusted to that level or within range. So basically I've taken a lot of the pressure off the cattle. I'm drifting them across the landscape. I might even bring them, I think on this ranch I'm not, but on the other ranch I'm actually going to bring them back onto a pasture they've already grazed during dormancy, to let them take a little bit more, but only once their gut is adjusting to a lower plane of nutrition. So from about mid-July to about mid-November is a really critical period of time for animal condition. And, these ranches, we're trying to get our calving and weaning schedule in line with the nutrition on it, calving, breeding, weaning, etc. And just trying to kind of cinch it all in to where every timeline is working together coherently. There's a general rule of thumb that as grass is growing fast, you're moving animals fast, and when it's growing slow, you're moving them slow. And that's because when grass is growing fast, where the cattle are not is as important as where they are, but of course where they are determines where they're not, right? So a lot of the high density stuff that we get excited about during the growing season is not just about laying down lots of material. It's often about keeping them together and collected so that the rest of the ranch can have more time to grow and get up ahead of it. So for any given goal, there's sometimes a few different ways to get there. Here, obviously we're trying to use the cattle to rehabilitate an overgrazed grassland, but we also have to make sure that they maintain appropriate condition during that time. So there's all these constraints to it.
How long do you think it takes you, with your experience now, to really familiarize yourself with a property?
It's getting shorter, but of course, anytime I feel confident I know what's going on is a sure sign that I'm about to have, a surprising discovery. So, for me, one of the most important approaches to a land base is just kind of this open, just constant question mark floating above my head, just constantly looking out and assuming I don't know what's going on, which is very hard to do because we want to know and we want to implement. But I'm learning increasingly also what specific questions to ask. So here, I didn't feel like I could really make a coherent grazing plan until I realized that if I start to pay attention to some features of the plants we're managing for, which is specifically the native perennial grass plants, bunch grass plants, then I could adjust everything else around that. So a couple things there are the questions of if cattle are in a pasture at moderate density, are they actually even eating those grass plants? And some of the time they're not going to, because typically the perennial grass plants have the native perennial grass plants have a higher consistent level of protein than a lot of the other annual grass plants. So this time of year, when protein is the real missing link for their digestive cycle, it's the most scarce nutrient, they're actually they're eating that stuff, they're sniffing it out. You can see, you'll see a swath of annual grass plants that are, of course, dormant, have gone to seed, and that won't even be touched, just be walked on, and then there'll be just a nub, of a perennial plant. So they're kind of targeting it this time of year. And for out here, I'd say that's approximately mid-July to approximately mid-November. So it's coinciding with the hardest time of year for them metabolically. Once we get new grasses growing, the cows don't pay too much attention to the perennial grass plants unless they're running really high density. They're just looking for other things. And in springtime, they really want the carbohydrate-rich annual grasses. So they don't seem to pay too much attention to the perennials then. So that's one question, is for a given species or a given functional group of plants, when are the cattle actually eating that in average conditions, And then the other question is, during what period of time is that plant trying to grow and recover? They might be eating it right now, and I can take them out of a pasture and put them back in that pasture. And if the plant hasn't regrown, then there's nothing for them to regraze, right? There's no way for them to get their tongue around it to take a further bite. And typically, I would say, when I see cows eating perennial plants, they mostly seem to take it down pretty far. They don't leave a lot to come back to later. They'll skim the tops of annual grasses and they'll grow fast, but during dormancy, they don't leave a lot for them to come back to. But even if they did, it's fine because the plant hasn't started to recover. I'd say something like October 1st is what I put in my grazing plan as when those plants will start to grow again, even if we don't have any moisture, which, is due to forces a little bit beyond my understanding, but my guess is that with their deep and expansive root system, they're able to tap water and start to grow once the soil temperature is more favorable to them, because they are cool season plants, right? So they're going to start to grow and start photosynthesizing, and that's when I want to make sure that the cattle are not regrazing them. So they can, I've set aside pasture here that they have not grazed since spring, so they can be on that and eat all those perennials to their heart's content. They'll be growing slowly, so even if I have them in a big pasture, the chances of them coming back and regrazing that plant within a 3-week period when it's growing very slowly are pretty slim. But I'm making sure those plants are being grazed for the first time, and then the cows are on the rest of the ranch while those are recovering, and then they come back, when they're appropriately recovered. So sometimes that means, and that's, I think, a primary difference between truly planned grazing and rotational grazing. Rotational grazing is a bit more incidental. You're moving cattle not necessarily through a fixed rotation, but you're moving them a little more vaguely, and they're just incidentals that happen in the way. It's kind of like if a train was just traversing its tracks at a slow pace and people had to just hop on and off, and just wing it, right? It wasn't stopping at a certain time or backing up or making sure the passengers are on and off safely. Whereas planned grazing is more about, hurrying up to get to this place, staying there for everybody to get on board or off board, taking this route over here because of these reasons. It's about making decisions down here all around to get to this specific thing that you care about. You know?
And part of that means, I guess, having more land than you need or having less cattle than the land can handle, so to give yourself that optionality to move around?
Not necessarily. I mean, there's a lot of places that through their planned grazing are running 2 or 3 times the stocking rate of surrounding ranches. It's more about making sure that the resources you do have, you're managing for buffer. You're making decisions that are allowing buffer. So that doesn't necessarily mean being understocked, but it does mean that you have pastures in mind and contingency plans in place where you can take the cattle to hold them longer, to let this get 20 more days of rest if necessary. So it's basically looking at your landscape and saying, what are the really strategic moves I can do on the places that are less critical so that the critical goals are achieved?
So how many moves are you thinking ahead now?
I mean, I'm thinking ahead less in terms of moves and more in terms of months. So I've got this place planned out into about mid-February in broad blocks, you know. And that's important because things come up, and if I just end up putting cattle back on a pasture that I haven't deemed like a sacrifice pasture because I wanted them nearby because the vet's coming in 2 days, and they end up grazing all the perennials I was planning on recovering, then it's like, what's the point of me doing what I'm doing, you know?
Yeah. Well, one thing about plans is they can be great in idea, great on paper, not in reality. How do you take your plan to February and allow it to shift based upon climate conditions,
Sure.
bad assumptions, something happens with the cows themselves?
Yeah. It's for all of those possible incidents that we plan, because the plan isn't so much about an instruction manual, it's the discovery process of understanding what's important and what the options are to maneuver around to achieve that. So the plan is informing what I'm doing if conditions go according to my assumptions, but it's also informing me of what's important and what's possible if things go awry, you know? So maybe I'd plan to put them in a specific pasture for a period of time because my goal is maximum recovery for, you know, a set of plant species. And let's say we get a crazy rainstorm and I actually need to put them in that pasture because that's the best pasture with the most kind of surplus forage to cushion against hoof impact. Well, then I still know I'm recording that happened so that I can help get that pasture back on track later, you know, make sure it has adequate recovery period after that. But I also know, okay, the reason I wanted to put them there was to have more buffer, right? So, or was because I was concerned about, you know, the reason I didn't want to put them there is because I was concerned about plant recovery. That might mean that I am making decisions with my resources next year to hold less critical pastures with a little extra forage, you know, or ones that are closer to the barn or something like that, closer to access. Basically, it's informing me of what my goals are so I can make better, more precise decisions the next go around. If we don't have a plan to change, then we're just looking in and out of our results.
And really the overarching goal I'm thinking hearing this is you want them to graze what they should when they should. Exactly.
It's all about having the animals at the right place at the right time for the right reasons. And it really is deciding what's important and working backwards from there. So that's why when people say the plan kind of writes itself, that's what they mean. It's kind of like you have this system, you care about these things, that the things that we hold constant help to draw everything else into alignment underneath them. You know, if I know I'm going to have the vet out on Tuesday, that means on Monday I need to have the animals in the corral and start sorting them so that I can easily bring them through on 8 a.m. on Monday morning, you know. And also having a grazing plan for things like that means I know, you know, what my sacrifice paddocks are, or if I don't have any, I know that I can't put them there even if it's closer to the corrals because those plants are recovering, you know. So there's so many dimensions to this stuff. It's hard enough to run a ranch without these ecological goals that when you add, or social goals, financial goals, when you add those critical specifics on top of that, it becomes easier than if we didn't have these constraints articulated. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's very liberating, actually.